Well, thank you everyone for being here. And I want to apologize at the outset. I sound a little rough because I'm fighting a cold, which I guess that's a problem with February webinars. So, but yeah, I'm really pleased to have you all on the line to talk about some research on shrubs, which is it's a component of the vegetation community that I've over time started thinking more and more about. And yeah, with that, we'll move on. So the motivation for the work that I'm presenting today comes out of a sort of broader research program that I've been engaged with along with a number of other people, which is looking at how wildfire is reshaping landscapes, vegetation communities, fire regime characteristics, post-fire communities, and especially as the world changes. As we're seeing these changes in the types of fires that are burning, the timing, the intensity of fires, and it's expressing itself at landscape scales and larger. And this is the kind of thing that scientists and managers moving forward that we're really going to have to attend to. One of the things that also drives this work is an understanding that fires really are apparently behaving differently now and in the recent past than they did in the deeper past. And this is a fire chart coming out of the Chiricahuas. I've split it up by 3 vegetation types, or topographic, forest types. But what you see here is that at the tree level, all of those, so each horizontal line is a tree, all the vertical tick marks are fire events. You see a lot of fire over the past 500 or more years in the Chiricahuas. And these are fires that they may have been pretty extensive. They may have burned all or nearly all of the Chiricahuas in a single year, but what they weren't doing was causing widespread mortality. And so that's the sort of past that we're moving out of as climate change accelerates and as structural changes to forests have been accelerating. And so it's worth saying that that chart that I just showed, I mean, people have been implicated in fire for a very long time in this landscape. The Chiricahuas have been occupied, these landscapes have been occupied, and people use fire. But the really striking changes that our landscapes have been seeing have really started to accelerate after Euro and after American settlement of the West. And it happens in several major ways. Through grazing, so livestock, which disrupts fine fuel continuity. Through logging, which they create fire breaks, but they also alter forest structure, the structural characteristics, and then the demography, so the species in different abundances and the age classes, and then also the composition a little bit. And then finally, formal policies. So fire prevention and fire suppression policies have also allowed forests to change over, essentially in a lot of these landscapes, a century or more of management under the current political regimes. And so here's what we're left with. Coming out of a lot of these recent fires, we have these landscape mosaics. So what you see in this photograph, in the foreground, there are 2 living trees, of which you can't see the canopy. There's an awful lot of, ferns. There's grass. In the background on that ridge, you see the effects of, a really big patch of high severity fire that killed every single tree. And then in the middle ground, patches of trees with lofted canopies, moderate severity fire ran through there. And then in the sort of immediate foreground, you can see some dead saplings because there was a high severity fire. It killed all the overstory trees, and then that was reburned at moderate or high severity as fire ran up through that grass and ferns. And so it killed the regeneration that it established. It was about 18 years old. And so, this is the sort of thing that's really apparent. And then also, where I've put that arrow, you can see shrubs. There are these shrub patches that are also coming in, depending on where they were able to establish. So this is the sort of thing that we're seeing and are going to continue to see with these large, severe fires that are burning with fairly large patch sizes. Okay, so then the larger research agenda that this piece about shrubs comes out of is I was looking at mixed severity reburning. And I'll get into that a little bit more, like what I mean, but trying to answer questions about whether antecedent disturbance, the older disturbances, reshape vegetation in ways that echo up through the, the recent past, or if it's the more recent event that really drives the patterns of vegetation that we see. Trying to ask questions about which vegetation communities and whether certain vegetation communities are resilient to certain repeated sequences of burning, moderate severity fire followed by low severity fire, unburned areas seeing low severity fire, things of that nature. And then finally, whether there are sequences of fire severity that promote structural tipping points between different forest classes, so forest converting to shrub field. So I'll talk more about that a little bit as well. The research that I'm presenting today has been published, and so we have here, I'll circle it. We have the citation here if you want to go look at the paper from which some of the graphs were drawn, but this presentation has much better photographs. Okay. So a lot of the work we do, of course, is grounded in place, and so the place that I'm talking about is the Chiricahua Mountains, located in far southeastern Arizona, in a province that are called the Madrean Sierra Madre Sky Islands, or the Arizona Sky Islands. And so they represent a sort of mixing zone between the Rockies and then the Sierra Madre to the south. The Chiricahuas themselves are the largest and the most biodiverse of all the Sky Islands. And that's true across a lot of different kinds of taxa, like birds, herbs, and especially vegetation. And what you're seeing here in this map are the results of two fires, which end up producing the conditions to sort of do the study. So we have in 1994 the rattlesnake fire, which burned at pretty high elevation, 6,000 feet and higher, and often in pretty heavy timber. That was then reburned in 2011 in the Horseshoe Two fire, which over the course of a little more than a month burned the entire range. And so that gives us the opportunity, using MTBS data, the monitoring trends and burn severity data, to look at the effects of reburns with a period of time in between. To zoom into the study site, I was working in 3 vegetation types, and you can think of them as, change the color on this, okay, as lower pine oak, that light green, upper pine oak, the darker green, and then mixed conifer, that blue color. So we weren't working up in the very highest veg type, aspens and wet mixed conifer, but this is a pretty good range in elevations. And we have our plots arrayed by fire severities. And then anyone who's familiar with Joe Gainey and Pepe Iniguez and other people at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, their work, you'll recognize these sorts of transects that we have here, where I was monitoring some of their plots and using that opportunity to do this work. All right. So the question could be, and I certainly sort of started out this way, but why study shrubs? I mean, it's not a common thing in the tree ring laboratory here at Arizona, shrubs, but we see them on the landscape a lot. And so as I dug into it, it's worth pointing out certain features, like that shrubs are really fire resilient. Shrubs and fire in a lot of different ecosystems and ecotypes worldwide go hand in hand. And a lot of shrub species and then communities of species have really high fire tolerance. So they're able to tolerate fire. They're able to recover rapidly after fire because a lot of shrub species have regeneration strategies that allow them to. And some shrubs combine regeneration strategies. They can grow from seed. They can resprout. But as a class of plants, woody shrubs are really able to do quite a bit as far as recovering from fire and then tolerating repeated fire. A lot of the species that we encounter are resistant to fire injury. And the images here show that pretty well. You can end up in areas where you have single-stemmed or monopodial oak trees in this case. That same species, if you burn it and top kill it, will resprout. And so, here's some of those examples. And you can see the dead leaders on there. And so the shrubs themselves are able to have a really plastic response to disturbance. They don't have to come back in the form in which they were before the disturbance happened. And so shrubs end up being a pretty powerful way of looking at how response to disturbance is likely to express itself on the landscape. So So coming out of some of the work that I've done, I'm just going to present this pretty quickly, but it's worth saying that within the 3 vegetation types in which I worked, so again, we have the lower pine oak, upper pine oak, and then mixed conifer, so sort of arrayed along an elevational gradient in this graph, that shrubs are fairly common, and they're expressed in all of the vegetation types, but in differing abundance. And so what you should be looking at in these ones are these light green colors for all the vegetation types. And then on the way to interpret this down here is that these are sequences of fire severity. So high severity fire followed by high again. So here's the pointer. Okay, so high severity fire followed by high, moderate followed by high, come down to this end. These are areas that were unburned in those 2 fires that I talked about, the 1994 and 2011 fires. High severity followed by unburned, moderate followed by unburned. So that's how to interpret this. And so, so again, I mean, shrubs are common, and they're especially common in the lower elevations and in these pine oak systems. And if you're kind of looking ahead, you'll see that there's a strong response to certain kinds of fire, combinations of fire severity, which tend to promote shrubs on the landscape. And so, so that's one way. It's an important thing to say at the outset. Another thing, and this is coming out of a larger body of work that I've been doing, is that trees, and those could be trees that could express as shrubs, or things like pines and Doug firs and things, they persist under repeated fire unless you have recent high severity fire or repeated moderate and high severity fire. And so what you should be looking for in these are the pink bars, which you can see, and then also the dark green bars. So pink representing these gymnosperms, all of the large pines that we have, Chihuahua pine, other gymnosperms, white fir, things of that nature. So that's what you should be looking for here. And basically what you'll see is that under a lot of sequences of fire severity, including things that were high severity and then are followed by low severity, is that you can retain a pretty good component of of the trees that the forest previously held. So that's a a good thing to know, that as we see places burn and reburn, even places that experienced relatively high or even repeated moderate severity fire, you may knock them back a little bit, but as far as proportional abundance go, they'll express on the landscape. And finally, the fact that fires increase shrub cover, and depending on the severity sequences, you could have as much as 80 or 90% shrub cover on a landscape following, and especially in certain vegetation types, but following fire. And you see that in the pine oak systems. You see pretty high shrub proportions, above 60%, even in mixed conifer. And so, you'll see that. So depending on what's on the ground and what's able to seed in and then resprout, you see quite a bit of shrub cover, and especially after recent high severity fire, things inside this oval, or repeated moderate and other sequences. And finally, there are other kinds of vegetation that are worth bringing up, and that's because these represent pretty volatile fire-spreading fuel types. But the yellow color that you can see here, there's a little bit of it, of course, on the landscape all the time. And then the blue color. So you see here, which is bracken fern or other kinds of fern, those can become pretty dominant, but really especially in mixed conifer and especially after recent high severity fire events or repeated moderate severity fire. And so that's where you start to see conversion away from even shrubs and into more meadow ecosystems. Okay, so the study that I'm presenting today in this webinar, we're looking at shrubs particularly and sort of how they express on the landscape. And so these bullet points here are basically coming out of those bar charts that I just showed you. And so we're seeing that repeated moderate and high severity fire are reshaping vegetation communities, tipping the balance towards shrub species. But there's some questions that arose, like what are the spatial patterns of these things? And then what is the kind of architecture that they have? Because that, of course, has implications for fuel and fire spread into the future. And so it's worth pointing out that what we're really looking at here, we're looking at small and intermediate scales. We're looking at individuals and small patches, so conjoined patches of individual shrubs. That's really what we're looking at here. So not landscape scale things so much as smaller sizes. And so the patches, because of the plots that I did, end up being less than 1,000 square meters. We're looking at stems that are less than 4 centimeters in dBH. Anything bigger than that, I'd have classified it as a tree. Working, again, in highly biodiverse mountain forests in southeastern Arizona in a place dominated by the North American monsoon, which is a point that I'll get to later. And so these incredibly beautiful images are things that I created to sort of, like this is what we're looking at. So, shrubs with a single stem, a certain amount of canopy. Sometimes, multiple stems with a certain amount of canopy. Or, things that are either seeding or sprouting that have a lot of stems, representing larger patches. And there are a lot of different ways that this can happen. It's worth pointing out that what I didn't look at, what this study doesn't seek to do, is to make claims about landscape scale fire scars that end up producing shrub patches. And the work that Chris Gitterman, Ellis Margolis, and others have been doing, especially in the Jemez Mountains, is really kind of illustrative of a different way of looking at shrubs. And it's a different kind of landscape. It's a landscape study I'm working at smaller scales here. So really I'm not focusing on the bigger patterns like this. I'm also not working in deserts or grasslands, which a lot of work even in the Sonoran Desert has been looking at shrub encroachment into grasslands, into deserts. And so we're really focused on mountain forests. So for this study, we have 25 plots. They're circular plots. They're 1/10 of a hectare. Again, working in these 3 vegetation types. And just as to repeat the purpose, working within the footprint of the Horseshoe 2 fire, but a little more than half of our plots were within the perimeter of that older fire, giving us the possibility of testing repeat burn characteristics. Okay, our methods are simple. We literally went out with straight tapes or reel tapes, and we measured shrub patches. And we did that by taking 2 measurements per shrub patch along the major and minor axis, in the process counting the number of stems per patch, and then from the axis measurements calculating an ellipse. We end up with over 850 patches of shrubs to analyze. Based on those data, and then the shrubs that we ended up encountering, we identified them to species. So then I categorized those by post-fire reproductive strategy. And so using the fire effects information system, using the species reviews of the 16 species that we encountered in those 25 plots, I ended up categorizing them into species that after fire are obligate reseeders, or things that are obligate resprouters. Most of the plants on this landscape make seeds, but a lot of the plants, like oaks, their acorns are not particularly fire tolerant. Some species, just the soils don't persist in the seed bank very long, or they're killed by fire. And so after a fire, as opposed to other sorts of disturbances, some plants really do have to reseed. Some plants do much better resprouting. From that, our analysis method was regression. We did linear and nonlinear regression, and you'll see that in the graphs. So just a sort of expression of our field work. Because we're working in southern Arizona in the monsoon, here's our field tarp. You can hide under there and take data with our excellent field computer. But this is just a sort of illustration of how our work does, how it happens, and here we are on the landscape. So again, this is what we're looking at, small patches. And we're looking at that relationship between canopy area and the number of stems. Which, of course, again, expresses in different ways. So that's how I'm using the word architecture. You could use other words like structure, but patch architecture is just that relationship between patch size and the number of stems that patch carries. And you can see that, you know, in this image where, you know, this part of, you know, you had a larger oak. After the fire, it's resprouting, but there are a lot of stems in here. And so after you measure the patch, you end up, you know, counting all of these things. So this entire area is carried by some number of stems. And so here we are into the results. So one of the things that happens is that as fire severity increases, what ends up happening to the patches is that they get larger. We measure larger patches on the landscape, and those patches have greater variance. And we see that expressed both in kind of mean characteristics, but also in the maximum patch size. So in unburned areas, patches are a little bit smaller, and you know, as severity increases, they just get larger and larger. You see that in terms of stem density, there's a different kind of signal where increases in fire severity tend to reduce the stem density. And you see that in terms of both mean and maximum as well. So what you're seeing after high severity fires, that larger shrub patches are typically carried by fewer stems, so more expansive canopy, and carried by fewer stems, normalized to meters squared. So it's a density measure. When we look at the effects, especially of different kinds of fire severity, what we see in this kind of graph, so we're not doing pairwise comparisons, but we're looking at things like, okay, testing unburned areas against low, moderate, and high severity, you know, shrubs. And what you end up seeing in this kind of situation is that these differences, and so the differences promoted by variations in fire severity, they're significant at moderate and high severity. And so, you know, you could read this. So unburned, you know, shrub patches growing in unburned areas are significantly different to those growing in moderate and high severity fires. So yeah, it's a pretty good thing to know. So you really are getting different structural characteristics following fires of different severity. And so the question might be, well, why does moderate and high severity fire create a different kind of pattern in terms of shrub architecture at small and intermediate scales? And so this is a thing where I'm extending a little bit beyond what my data can really tell me, and using literature and also, you know, thinking it through. And we think in part that this happens because moderate and high severity fire can remove that overstory canopy, whatever those previous species were. You know, if it's conifer forest or if it's other kinds of, you know, angiosperms like oaks or, you know, things like that, or aspens. Removing that overstory canopy produces space, right, where new things can grow. It changes the competitive dynamics. And so producing space for the ways that shrubs recover through resprouting, things, you know, like gamble oak can do that, but also for seeding in for the species that do that kind of thing. The other thing is that when you start having big canopy patches, big canopy gaps, that gives the ability for small patches unencumbered by light competition to merge into larger patches. And so that could be part of the signal that we're picking up. So I'll talk a little bit more about the regeneration strategy. So not just the structural characteristics, which are on those previous slides, but regeneration strategy. So there are several. We found 4 species, and I'll show that on the next slide, of plants that have to reseed after fire. Many more species that have to resprout, and they can resprout from different areas. But we had a pretty good number of patches for each kind of regeneration strategy, which gives us something to analyze. So in terms of the reseeders, if there are particular plants that you care about, Fendaler ceanothus is by far the most common, but hop tree, gooseberry, blueberry elder, we didn't see a lot of those. These are the plants that really, according to FEIS, have to, in this area, regenerate from seed. And so this, you know, anyone who's spent much time wandering around, you know what it's like to walk through a bunch of ceanothus. But it's a nitrogen fixer. It has great wildlife characteristics. It's a good plant on the landscape. The resprouter is much more common and much more abundant. And again, there's a greater range. You know, they're not just hatching from seeds, but they're sprouting from different parts of the plant, from the rhizomes, from the root crown, sometimes even adventitious rooting if you get sedimentation around them. And so there's a wide range of plants representing many more families, but by far dominated by the Madrean oaks that we were encountering. But other really important things like New Mexico locust, which can really come to dominate pretty big parts of the landscape. So, apologies. So we started looking at regeneration strategy and how that influences the patches on the landscape. And what we found is that the vegetation types themselves show a signal in terms of what you find, what kinds of shrubs end up growing on the landscapes. And so it's these reseeding species are especially abundant in mixed conifer, and especially after certain kinds of fire. But you see that here, where a test of significance shows that the pine oak systems are dominated by resprouters. I mean, it feels like a tautology in a way. I mean, we're calling it pine oak, and they're full of resprouting oaks. But the mixed conifer, you get a really different pattern. You get different species growing up there as well. One of the things that we see in terms of these architectural characteristics is that there's essentially no characteristic form of shrubs in terms of resprouters, right? So you can have really small shrub patches with tons and tons and tons of stems, or you can have really large patches with very few stems. And so that's there's just almost no end to the kind of responses that these plants can have. Seeding species, though, show a much stronger response, and it's something that a linear regression works reasonably well, but nonlinear works even better to fit this distribution where as patch size increases, the number of stems sort of tails off. So that's a sort of interesting pattern, and it probably has to do with the life history traits themselves. The ability of these things have to be coming from seeds, and so you might get tightly clustered seeds germinating, but you might get different. At the bigger sizes here, you might get more patches merging together on the landscape, but it's a much less plastic response than you see over here with the resprouting species. We also see that increases in fire severity end up strengthening that relationship. And so looking at all the species together, we're not looking at just the resprouters or just the cedars, but looking at all species. I could show 4 panels here, but at unburned and then low severity, the relationships are weaker, and they actually strengthen as severity increases. Meaning the fire is reorganizing these shrub patches, and it's creating a sort of typical relationship between the number of stems and the canopy size. The response is especially strong among the reseeders, species that have to reseed after fire. Although what's interesting, actually, I should point out, is that increasing trend is only true if you look at low, moderate, and high severity fire. But it's unburned areas, places that haven't seen disturbance for a long time, where the reseeding species have the strongest relationship between stems and canopy area. Probably in part because these things are fighting for space, they're fighting for light, and they're germinating from widely scattered seeds. And so that's probably part of what we see in that pattern. Another thing that we find coming out of this is that the kind of proportional dominance of seeding species, so that's here in the dark bars, versus resprouting species, that those really differ once you start getting into high severity fire. And these reseeding species, we were encountering fewer of them. They're a little less abundant on the landscape. But after high severity fire, that reshapes, we think, the competitive dynamics to the point where these things, if you're looking at stem densities, if you're looking at patch areas, they start to be dominant. They're above 50% of what you're finding out there. So it's really high severity fire is the signal that you'd have to look for in terms of predicting what sorts of plants, as far as these life histories traits, that you have on the landscape. Okay, good. One of the things that we were able to do, because 16 of our 25 plots were within the footprint of the rattlesnake fire, is that we were able to take these areas that were unburned in 1994 in that rattlesnake fire, and then look at what the effects are. So what we have are areas that, like in the left panel, were unburned, and in the rattlesnake and then the horseshoe 2 fires, that saw low severity fire in the rattlesnake and then went unburned, or then high severity fire in the rattlesnake that went unburned. And so what we see is that same kind of pattern, that strengthening effect of increasing fire severity on shrub architectural characteristics ends up persisting for decades. So once you set the stage in terms of the species compositions, the life history traits, whatever it is that comes in after the fire, whatever the severity was of those antecedent events, that will persist for decades until the next disturbance comes along and sort of resets it again. And so what you have in areas like this, locust and aspen patches, they're going to be on a different recovery trajectory. You're going to carry characteristics into the future. Once you start getting into landscapes like this, not a lot of shrubs, lofted canopies, widely spaced trees, that's a very different kind of system that's going to persist really for quite a while into the future. So both of these images at the bottom represent actually fire resilient and in some ways sort of fire resistant communities. Fire can reburn even at high severity, this kind of community, and it'll resprout just like it was. And you can probably, Ellis Margolis has been thinking about this a lot, run fire over and over these landscapes. You just keep sprouting up your aspens and robinia or New Mexico locust. Same with this. This is on the right panel, a vegetation type and a community that's probably pretty resistant to change, both in terms of what is there, but then also resilient under repeated, especially lower severity disturbances. So with the time remaining, I'm going to get into broader implications. And so these are things that aren't fully supported all the time by all of our data, but our data do sort of animate some of the things that I'm going to talk about here. And so worth repeating, I was working in a place that's strongly affected by the North American monsoon, meaning that there's a bimodal precipitation regime, and the hottest, driest times of year occur in May and June with very different fires that burn under these conditions. They tend to be large, so you get fewer ignitions, larger fires, higher severity. And then the monsoon sets up, and humidity increases. We get a lot of starts, but the fires tend to be a little bit smaller. And so thinking about the timing of these big severe events and then the timing of your less severe events, so the intensity of burning that you're getting in relation to how these shrubs are growing. They tend to have a winter dormant period. So when do they start growing? After a fire, when do they start regrowing? And when are the seeds best set to germinate, if that's how they choose to grow? So in relation to fire, those end up being really important characteristics. And so it's the timing of fire with these phenological signals from the plants themselves end up restructuring, I think, in important ways, the kinds of patterns that we have on the landscape and then the species compositions. And one of the things that the literature would suggest is that when you have these for-monsoon drought, high-intensity fires, the plants haven't been growing all that long. So this would be especially true in May. They haven't fixed a lot of carbohydrates, and so they're especially prone to injury and mortality under those kinds of conditions. So this is more, the top bullet is more of a conclusion point, but we're with fire severity, and especially increasing severity, seeing these predictable patterns at small and intermediate scales. What that ends up affecting, at least in a sort of management sense, is the spatial distribution of fuels. So how spaced out are these shrubs? How much air do you have underneath them? But the way that these things recover, either through germination or resprouting, that has a strong influence on fuels and ultimately on future burning. And then because of the ability to look at multiple events, the things that recover after a disturbance are going to persist in these characteristic ways. They'll continue to grow. They'll continue to expand. But these kinds of patterns are going to persist until the next disturbance rewrites it. Another thing that's worth highlighting is that regeneration strategy matters. And it matters in part because of this differential response to high severity fire. Resprouters end up showing a really broad range of responses. Resprouters are especially dominant after low and after moderate severity fire. It's after high severity fire that you start to see a lot of seeding species coming in, and especially those with really light wind-blown seeds. But so these resprouters really have a lot of options as far as how they respond to disturbance of varying severities. It's the reseeders that you see coming in into these large canopy gaps, these big areas where all the overstory has been killed. And especially if the fires are severe enough to really cook the soil, kill the seed bank, and also kill those below-ground carbohydrate stores and lignotubers or whatever the species have. That radically resets the competitive dynamics, and it allows new things to happen. And so what we end up seeing, and especially on landscapes where big hot fires have been happening, is a tipping point between things that were formerly forest, so these big patches over here, and regerminating or sprouting shrub fields. And so we're starting to see structural tipping points, and at landscape scales. Within the study area in which I work, there are not a lot of resprouting gymnosperms. We have Chihuahua pine, the junipers can resprout, and so high severity fire tends to really diminish the conifer component of the vegetation at the expense, and it tends to favor things like oaks, and then other kinds of angiosperm shrubs. One of the interesting things about the oaks, though, is that they can grow as tree form, but under certain disturbance intensities will tend to convert to shrubs. And so you can have a thing where the species composition doesn't change, but the structural characteristics do. And that has big implications for future fires, where you could have previously run fire under a lofted oak canopy, and now it's, the branches are touching the ground. That's a very different situation. And so it's the kind of historical disturbance characteristics that we used to have. High frequency, low severity fire, that's what's required to promote and maintain these conifer forests, at least in the southern Sky Islands. And it's when you start having less frequent and high severity events, you tend to knock back the conifer component and you start to favor these things, the oaks and then other kinds of shrubs. And so what I'd take you away with is that, shrubs have always been a part of this landscape. Over the past, we don't have great environmental history, but over the past century at least, they seem to have been an increasingly important part of the vegetation. And this is true in the Sky Islands and then across a lot of the rest of the West, even the less sort of biodiverse parts of the U.S. West. As fires are changing, they're getting more severe, and they're having larger patches, we're going to see that trend continue to larger and larger shrub patches with particular sorts of architectural characteristics. Really severe fire, and especially at higher elevations, is going to tip the balance towards reseeding species. Moderate severity fire, though, and especially under repeated conditions, might tend to favor resprouting shrub species. But if you want to balance conifers and then other components of the vegetation, it's going to take repeated low and moderate severity fire to make that happen. So, this has been basically a sort of, a Valentine's sort of statement of love for what's going to come to dominate a lot of the landscapes that we work in. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge my field crews who did fantastic work on this project. They really did a tremendous amount. The funding sources from the U of A and also from Arizona Firescape, mostly from the Coronado. And with that, take any questions that you guys have.
Well, thank you so much, Jesse. That was a great presentation and fascinating topic. So participants, feel free to go ahead and type in questions, and we'll read them out and answer them as we go here. And actually, we don't have all that many people, so we could probably open the phone lines. But while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll go ahead and ask one. You talked a little bit about the ability for, say, aspen, Robinia to kind of reburn over and over again. And it may be outside of the range of the data you studied because you had 2 particular fires. But I'm curious about the thinking around, is there a limit in terms of do you exhaust the starch stores or carbohydrate stores to resprout if the fires are too close together in time? Or I guess you talked a little bit about the high-on-high requiring reseeders as opposed to sprouters. But I guess given that this seems to be a type we're seeing more of and may live with more closely, thinking a little bit about some of its attributes.
Yeah, that's an important question, and it's one that I'm aware of work that's looking at that particular thing, like how closely spaced can you have fire of varying characteristics or varying severities without exceeding the ability of the veg to respond favorably. And FEIS, their species reviews are really good, and they sometimes have that information. I'm especially aware of that coming out of Mediterranean ecosystems, so especially in California, and then up into the Sierras. There's been a lot of work done on shrubs in those environments. And I know that Dylan Schwilk has been doing this kind of work in the Chihuahuan Desert as well. So but it's a thing that I'm just not as aware of being done in Arizona and New Mexico. Yeah, just those particular studies. But one thing that's clear is that some plants are better able to weather back-to-back or closely spaced fires. And even if one or both of them are intense, some species can handle that. But a lot of them really can't. And so the resprouting vigor will decrease over subsequent events. And so I think because my fires were spaced out by more than a decade and a half, it could be that the climate conditions weren't so terrible, and so the plants were able to build up stores and then respond, where really frequent and especially frequent hot fire might really diminish their recovery ability.
Great, thank you.
Xander, that's a great question.
Thanks. Sounds like something we'll hear more about in the future. Jonathan Long had a question about publishing results on the shift in oak architecture from tree form to shrubby form. Yeah, that is a thing where I have a little bit of data, and it's not enough to go with. And so it's a project actually that I'm thinking about in terms of looking at those environments and particularly that kind of response. And actually, to take Jonathan's question, it's not just going from arboreal oaks to shrub oaks, but also the other way around. I'm really curious about whether these multiple-stemmed oak patches, whether they over time can self-prune and then take one or just a couple stems. How long does that take, and how good are they at doing that? If disturbance is sort of limited for a while, either if it doesn't happen, if it ceases, or if it's low severity enough, or whether once things kind of burn, like you see in this image here, you top kill some oaks and then they start sprouting vigorously, if they're sort of going to be shrubs for the meaningful future. So I don't have anything published, and it'll be a little while before we have those data. But Jonathan, that's a question that I really think about, and would. Offline, if you have ideas, I'd love to talk with you. Great, thank you. Yeah, I think with these, maybe they're not quite novel ecosystems, but changing ecosystems, there's lots of potential research topics. Other questions? Maybe I'll go ahead and unmute the line, and people can. So you should be unmuted, so if you want to just ask a question outright, I think we're ready for that too. Or you can type it if that's easier. All right, well, you may have You may have exhausted the audience, Jesse.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. I really appreciate y'all calling in and watching this. It's yeah, I appreciate the chance to give a talk.
Great. Well, thank you. It was a really interesting and informative talk, and I look forward to all of you who are on the phone line. I look forward to joining you again on future webinars. And if you have suggestions for webinars or other activities the consortium should do, please let me know. Please, you can email me or Barb or get on the website and send something in. So thanks again, Jesse. And with that, I'll close down the webinar.
All right. Thank you all.